Okay, in this session what we're doing is continuing our discussion around the right to liberty for persons with disabilities. And as with all aspects of human rights, and in particular for our discussion, the rights of persons with disability through CRPD, it's very much an interrelated process, but focusing on the discussion that we've had in the last hour or so this morning around deprivation of liberty and the right to liberty, we've been joined with Alberto Vasquez and Elizabeth Kamundia to join in the conversation to explore the right to liberty a bit further. It's an interactive session. We will be having questions from you and from the panellists between each other, I hope. I hope we're all up for challenging each other. Please forgive my voice. And I'd like to start the ball rolling by asking the panellists their thoughts on one of the questions that Amita raised very early in her paper, was the need to move away from notions of what in some contexts is called the character extension. And it was that debate around solely and how important it is to shift from this understanding that because of a diagnosis, there is this character extension. And this character extension are attributes that are imputed to people. Most commonly, as you heard the discussions go on, they are attributes, negative attributes around behaviour and potential behaviour. And it's so I suppose what I want to ask the panel is where they place the importance of moving on from that and how it will change the way laws can be framed. So we can go left to right, right to left, start in the middle. Amita, since you raised the debate around the inclusion of the term solely and the notion of the character extension, would you like to start maybe?
This is either right or left.
No, it's right in the middle. I said in the middle was an option.
Okay. I suppose the way I see it is that the moment you did not take the solely formulation in Article 14, what you did somewhere was that the very particular kinds of laws which were made for people with disabilities, only people with disabilities in mind, believing that there were certain kinds of attributes which were unique to persons with disabilities, that was, in my understanding, outlawed. And it being outlawed means that a certain very foundational interrogation in relation to compulsory commitment laws, in laws which were only kind of targeting persons with disabilities, to say, all right, person with disability, dangerous to self or others, person with disability, not being competent and not able to take care of. Disability is a threshold, but from that threshold, you were also putting other kind of attributes. And if you compare that to the formulation which is in fact being adopted, you are somewhere saying that this uniqueness sort of thing that was being done for persons with disabilities, and to say either they need a proportion of protection which is way higher than is required by the populace at large, or they are in some manners dodgy, dangerous people who need to be kind of put under special sort of social control measures. Both got outlawed. And I think that is a lot, when you sort of deduce from the text which has come, then there is this question which I think was raised subsequently, which I think Diana raised to your line, as to what's your take on mental health laws. Because a large part of mental health laws is primarily compulsory care. There is not very much else that comes in there. You do some kind of notional stuff on conditions of institutions and what should be a basic minimum care and living conditions and stuff. But the rationale or the reason to be for mental health laws is compulsory care. And Article 14, to that extent, as formulated, has put a huge question mark on compulsory care laws. That would be my first sort of thing.
Okay. Alberto, would you care to comment?
I will put something else on the table from Amita. I think the discussion about mental health legislation in general is a very important one. And I think following her comments, I would say, and also it's a very risky task. We can try to think about CRPD-based mental health legislation. Is it possible? And I think one of the experiences of the Peruvian context was in the process of taking down legislation on involuntary detention of persons with psychosocial disabilities, there was this proposal that actually was enacted on including all the provisions related to mental health just in the general health legislation. And in that take, the focus wasn't on actually how you regulate social control, or how you regulate involuntary care, but was rather on how you ensure a human rights approach in the access of health services in general for persons with psychosocial disabilities. And I think the question is very related to what Jolaine was saying. I think states are still thinking about on that care could be only provided on the basis of involuntary relationships, because the main focus on all those discussions, even within us, is always how we get to the exceptional case. And we're focusing too much in the exceptional case, and we're not thinking about how we transform the system to actually think about a continuum of care and support to people, even in those situations that for most of us, we have little idea how to deal with. But there are examples, and there are some good experience. I think we have to explore more how we provide support on emergency situations, how we provide support in a situation where normally somebody will call this person is treating their own life. So I think we have to turn around the discussion, and I think we're not doing that with the states. We're still trying to negotiate with the state where is the line. And now we're saying there is no line. The line is completely covered. But if we don't go back to the original pulsion, why the state is trying to do this is because social control, paternalistic approach, or it's just fear, or it's just because we don't know how to deal with this type of situations, and we don't know how to provide support in those types of situations. And then the law comes in, and we're trying to draw a line that maybe we need to think about first in terms of policies and services, and how we reframe alternative to traditional mental health services. I don't know if I'm just going around.
Yep. Yolande, I want to pick up on, it would be good if you could pick up on what Alberto was saying. One of the things that I really liked about your presentation was the focus on problem solving, and that taking a non-medicalised approach to mental health issues. So, would you mind?
Well, when I was institutionalized and put through all these harsh measures, I constantly said that it was not helping me and that I didn't want to live like that. But they didn't listen. They only saw this as a part of the illness. So everything I said was part of the illness. And they constantly said that I was not able to consent because I didn't agree to what was offered to me. And while I clearly said that I needed something else. And I think this is such a big problem because like everything I said was not believed. Even when I had medical problems, they said, oh, you're only asking for attention. So this character-based approach is so neglective of everything that you can be as a person. Because even when you are confused, you are still a person and you still have wishes. But if it's all put in this medical approach where they see every form of resistance as an illness or as a symptom of the illness, then you can never have influence on your treatment. Because every time you say no, they will say, you see, you're ill, you're unable to consent. So this is, it's just not possible to make a system on this basis. Yeah, I don't know how to say.
I suppose, I mean, what Alberto was saying was that there is still going to be emergency situations where people, where people will be looking for support of some description, whether it be medicalised or whether it not be medicalised. And it's how we deal with that at the same time as trying to deal with how the state has formulated, measures around mental illness. Amita, did you want to contribute at this point?
Both what Alberto was saying. See, the point I was making, why Article 14's total ouster of force, coupled with the fact that you have a right to integrity, the manner in which you are addressing the right to health, wherein informed consent is given the sort of space, needs to be taken on board to formulate or think about, human rights consonant mental health. And for that, it's the point which Yolaine is making, and I think it needs to be reiterated again and again, and largely why states are wanting to endorse force is, if you are only going to give me the choice between institutionalization and no treatment, that is, I can assert, and supposing we accept the fact that no force, but the only kind of choice you're going to give me is that you do not develop any sort of alternatives. It is either you kind of go ahead and take the treatment which is on offer, or you die with your rights on. Nobody is asking for the second, or nor are you asking for the first. My point somewhere was, if we look at the Article 14 discourse as saying one kind of thing is ousted to you, now develop the rest, then you are sort of working out a discourse which is a pro-CRPD discourse. And the reason why, that's the last line I would want to make, in my opinion, the reason why states keep falling back on force is because it's a cheap way of trying to address distress.
Yeah. Taking up from there, Amita, I was reflecting in the morning about Kenya's Mental Health Act as I listened to your presentations, and one of the reasons where someone can be deprived of liberty under our Mental Health Act is a combination of disability and likeliness to act in an offensive manner to public decency. So never even mind danger to self, not that that is okay, but if you're likely to act in the opinion of the police officer or the local chief in a way that is offensive to public decency, you can be deprived of your liberty. And another one is that you can also be deprived of your liberty if you are being treated in a cruel manner by your relatives. And this really is quite striking, that instead of arresting your relatives who are treating you in a cruel manner, it is you who has a disability who will be deprived of your liberty to keep you safe. And this links up really well with what Amita was saying and what Alberto said as well. well about the lack of services, the lack of alternatives, and because the state hasn't developed those, then institutionalization becomes the cheaper way to deal with this issue.
Yeah, if you are having problems of rape, then let's lock the women up.
Let's lock the women up, exactly.
Joan, did you wish to say something? Did you wish to add something? Can we pass the mic along?
Yeah, because unfortunately in the Netherlands we have the same grounds in a new law. Also, financial reasons can be a reason for forced treatment, and a lot of also the things you mentioned. And in the Netherlands, of course, we have a lot of money. We could have had alternatives, but they are not there because it's really in their minds that they need to have control over these dangerous people who are incapable. And that's just not true, because it's really a social problem. Mental health crisis, it has an origin in, it's psychosocial. The social component is the most important, and actually the social component is the thing that you can change, because you cannot change the person, so you can only change the social circumstances. And it's widely known that the social circumstances are crucial for either deterioration, going worse, or recovery and going better, having chances and opportunities. So, and in fact, all the psychosocial problems are linked to despair and inner disturbance and panic. And what you see then is that the surroundings, they don't know, so they also panic, and they intervene in a very harsh way without listening. And that is the system, and we are fighting very hard, of course. Because I think it's most important to listen, and that's exactly what's not happening. When there's a crisis team in the Netherlands coming to a person that has a crisis, then they want to have a solution in like 20 minutes or so. They are just waiting there, and they say, "Are you coming voluntarily, or do we have to force you?" So this is...
That's the choice.
That's the choice. And if you say, "I don't want it," then they say, "Okay, we're gonna force you." And
You
even...
like insight, man. You like insight.
But even when you have...
That's the next reasoning we just put out when you say no, that you like insight.
One of the things myself and my colleagues, when we first started going to the negotiations back in 2002, 2003, was to move away, the challenge to move away from the care, treatment and protection focus that disability, and especially psychosocial disability, was constrained by. And you see that reflected very much in the discussions around deprivation of liberty. And so to move away from care, treatment and protection, we saw this as an opportunity to maybe get some prescriptive normative content into the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to move beyond the medicalisation of mental health. In lots of ways, the Convention could be argued to be silent in lots of this respect. Do you think that's problematic? And do you think there's opportunities for the jurisprudence to address that normative content? And I open it to any of the panellists. Kunto?
Yeah, I think that it's following a little bit on what Alberto said. It's I think that the CRPD provides all of the good answers around this, right? There is a systemic approach that at some point I think it's been disregarded in this sense. The first cornerstone to tackle this issue would be to establish the very clear ban on deprivation of liberty as the CRPD committee did. Because by doing that, you are forcing the system to move in a different direction. And that is the first starting point. The second starting point would be, okay, once done that there is this standard in place, what are the secondary measures that should be following after that? And then you move into the recognition of legal capacity and to consent or to reject treatment. And once you open that door, also, then what are the alternatives that should be in place, as Alberto was saying, in order to provide a real alternative to people to either engage on a particular kind of treatment that the person wants, and what are the services that are based in the community, what are the decision-making processes that you can engage with, and that it's by itself, it's kind of pushing the system into reverting the process. What's happening now, it's, from a normative perspective, the system is jumping into the worst possible punishment first. And it is really something quite particular to say, well, the worst thing that we can do according to every single system, other than those that have death penalty, is to deprive a person of his or her liberty. And what the system is actually providing is to first jump on that, and then we consider any other second possible choices, which really doesn't make any sense from a normative perspective. The other thing that we didn't mention before, but it was something also that when we went through the analysis of the CRPD discussions, there were these 2 points, right? One was the solely, so the discarding the solely or the qualifiers from the system. And the second one was the review. Do you remember the discussion during the ad hoc committee, the article, it wasn't 14, it was 10 at that moment. And it has three points, so A, B, and C. The third one, the 10C of the CRPD, and in the ad hoc committee, was talking about review of the detention condition. And it was also struck down. At the end, it was in the 7th ad hoc committee meeting. And it was struck down because by allowing any kind of possible deprivation of liberty, and by including the possibility of reviewing the detention, actually, there was an argument to say that you are making legal the possibility of detaining something. And that was moved from the 10C to the review of the conditions of detention to Article 16 now. And that was key, because by allowing any kind of deprivation of liberty on the basis of disability, and that by providing the possibility of reviewing the detention, then the system would have left a gap in the legal structure around that. But it's out. It's not on Article 14 now. It's nowhere. And the only thing that we can say is that if a person is deprived of his or her liberty, then we have to review the conditions of detention under Article 16. So the system, I would say that the normative perspective on this, it's quite complete. It's quite comprehensive in that sense.
Yeah, I suppose what I was getting at was about the development of alternative mechanisms and treatment. So we'll go through Elizabeth and Alberto.
So I just wanted to share an alternative, or the beginnings of thinking about alternatives to non-medicalized approaches to mental health care that's being developed by users and survivors of psychiatry in Kenya. And it's the use of technology, so the use of WhatsApp. So the peers are in a WhatsApp group where you can post, for example, that you're in distress and that you're feeling like this or like that, and you get a lot of immediate feedback from your peers. And on occasion, someone has posted, for example, that they are feeling suicidal and proceeded to go offline. And so some of the questions that have arisen then from amongst the peers, and this is something we have discussed, is what should the response of the peers be in such a circumstance? And then, so right now it's about pulling together money, because as you will notice, the state is not really one of the actors we are looking to provide a solution in at least in our context. So it's about pulling together money as peers so that the person nearest to the person can take a cab, be able to go there, be able to sit down with the person, talk to them, see how to de-escalate the situation. So that's one of the approaches that we are taking, but we still remain with the issue that was raised by Yanni about what if the person really needs to get away from their family situation, and what do you do when there are no midway alternatives? That still remains a concern for us, but definitely the use of social media, the use of kind of online support groups is emerging as one of the stronger ways in which people are supporting each other in non-medical ways in my context.
I would like to go back to and I think one of the first questions we had is in terms of, you mentioned that, and I think I like the quote of Gerald always says to resist the temptation of elegance in terms of and thinking that the CRPD will apply directly to our national legislations. And I think we have been seeing constantly that Article 14 has been one of the most challenging articles in being implemented at many levels. Even when you think about Article 12, you will think that countries are thinking about how we will implement. But I think the issue of absolute ban of deprivation of liberty on the basis of an impairment is something states are still struggling to think about. And it's not only states, and on that I will disagree that it's only because it's cheaper. I think there is a lack of understanding on how to reframe the support we're providing to persons with psychosocial or intellectual disabilities in general. And we can see that at the international level. The committee, the Human Rights Committee has a different understanding and keeps presenting a different understanding on the exceptions on deprivation of liberty in the case of danger to self or to others. And it's the same with other bodies at the UN level. And I think we're still struggling, even at the UN level, to achieve that the CRPD became the most highest standard and that all the other mechanisms in the UN system align with those standards. So I think there is an issue there, that there is a gap probably that we have to fill in some way. I don't have the answers, but I think that's, I think the reframing the discussion is something that we really need. And it's really linked with services. It's really linked how we understand mental health services in general. And the work of the World Health Organization in that role is very key in terms of, it's not really changing the way we think about how we provide support to people. And if we don't change that, it's going to be very difficult to change legislation too. Even when we pretend that the legislation has changed, that it is the case in Peru, practice won't change. Because even if you are not deprived of your liberty to get services will be provided in a way that are still paternalistic and are medical centered. And I think this goes beyond just deprivation of liberty.
Yolan, did you?
Yeah, because that touches about to something that are other motivators for the deprivation of liberty. For example, it used to be practice that when persons got institutionalized in the Netherlands, from the first day they go into solitary confinement for observation. They think this is a very scientific approach to isolate the person from the social surroundings, to look at the person themselves. They say it's a timeout. They say it's a low stimulus to be in solitary confinement. They say it's calming to be there because it's nothing there. And of course we had to fight a lot against this perception and clarify that when you're solitary confined, it's actually a lot of negative input that you're getting. The loneliness, the confusion, the abandonment, it's all very negative. there's nothing in the room, that's true, but that doesn't mean that there are no triggers. There's a lot of triggers. And we had to fight a very long way to reach this understanding with professionals that this is not a calming surrounding that is taking the triggers away from you. And these elements are very important to address, to change the view, because they really think that they are doing something good when they put us through these measures.
Thank you. What I'd like to do now is open it to questions from the floor. I see a few hands. How about we start up the back with Gabor?
Thank you very much. I would like to go beyond the law now for a moment and beyond even the services. I think we have to regretfully acknowledge that traditional mental health laws are very successful. They are so successful that they can be very easily abused. There are historical examples of political abuses of psychiatry. It's prone to be abused. Now, the CRPD says that actually, even if the intention for a forced treatment is not directly to abuse a person, it's actually abusive conduct. I think that one factor we haven't mentioned so far, which in my understanding is an important factor why traditional mental health laws and the services based on the traditional mental health laws, the coercive services, the privation of liberty included, are so successful, is that there are many actors, many powerful actors, whose interest is to have an easy and cheap way to put unwanted people, disturbing people into the refrigerator. Now, who are these actors? The states, and Amita mentioned the cheapness of the thing. It's also easy. I mean, if you have the legal ground to deprive persons of their liberty and lock up in institutions and treat them against their will, then it is quite easy to implement and realize. Families may feel that it is in their interest because simply without support available to the person and to the family in the community, they are in despair. Very often they contribute to the original crisis in the first place. So at least they can easily see that the existing system, including the law and everything which is built on it, is in their interest. And let's not forget pharmaceutical industry. Because we do know, that number 2, number 3 major income for the leading pharmaceutical companies come from psychotropic drugs. And exactly these psychotropic drugs are used either while you are in a forced treatment regime or while you are coerced to take your medication because that is the price you have to pay to keep your physical liberty. But evidently your liberty still is interfered with. But these are very important and very powerful actors who has an interest in maintaining the existing status quo. Just to remind you that in the past X number of American elections, leading pharmaceutical companies were primary sponsors to the election campaigns. So we can't ignore this. Now my question is, what do you suggest as an advocacy strategy to move the boundary in this conflict between paradigms, conflict between the existing system and what CRPD aspires and actually mandates? I see that what Jolain and Alberto suggest, that let's work much more on the alternatives. Let's demonstrate that alternatives can work, actually they do work, and they can be operated in a CRPD compliant manner. And actually there are wonderful alternatives already, here and there. They are not accessible to 99.99% of those who are in need, but they do exist. But my real concern is, that we have a catch-22 sort of situation. Unless we change the law, I see very little motivation for the policymakers to be open to allocate resources to have more and more alternatives. If it remains on small scale, NGO, DPO run, small alternatives, it will not have the potential, in my opinion, to push the boundary towards more and more people having access to the alternatives. But we cannot expect that changing the law will happen just because the CRPD says so. Some very powerful practical pressure or attraction should be offered. That's my view. And I do not see what this can be. That's a big problem for me.
Thank you, Gabor. Facundo?
Yeah, I agree with Gabor, and I think that what you are saying, it's a little bit in line with what I just said before, in terms of if you put the system in place, at least the legal system, that will push the system into looking for different alternatives. If we don't do that first, I think that the existence of existing law will always allow for the existing practices to continue. So that's a very important starting point. The second thing is regarding your question, and what would be an advice on advocacy efforts. I do think that in addition to all of those that you just mentioned, a very key actor on this will be the WHO. And they need to review their perspective around this. And they also have tools that can be also reviewed in the future. All that has to do with community-based rehabilitation structures and networks, which continue to be very much medicalized. And I wouldn't say that by moving from big psychiatric institutions into community-based structures that at the end of the day will be replicating exactly the same philosophy, we are actually advancing. I think that the impact of medicalized services in the community actually can reach out and condition even more the life of people than the institutions themselves. So I do think that the strategy should move on bringing on board the WHO in different perspectives, demedicalizing the services, and they are already starting to discuss that. It's not like this is a discussion that it's strange to them. And they do have the digitalization movement within the mental health movement that it's pushing for a different perspective on this. And I also agree that it will not happen only by the involvement of the disability movement on this. This has to be there must be a larger discussion around this. Unfortunately, what happened now in the Conference of State Parties last week, it's a very bad example of how to frame that discussion. Because it's not sitting people that were tortured by the psychiatric, by psychiatrists, sitting together with those that suffered those processes and sitting them on equal basis, that this will change. Because something that was raised in one of the side events that we participated with the WNUSP was that by enabling this discussion, we're forgetting the imbalance of power. And we cannot forget the imbalance of power. That's why we're talking about human rights. Because the convention comes to exist because we recognize that there is an imbalance of power. So these advocacy efforts cannot be done without keeping the dignity of the affected population. And this is something that WHO will have to understand at some point if we want to see an effective advocacy effort reaching anyway.
Alberto?
I just want to follow up on Gabor's comment in terms of that we need a very holistic advocacy approach. In most of the cases, mental health services are the source of most of the problem we're discussing today. including the privation of liberty. But at the same time, I would feel it's also a symptom of how society reacts to persons with psychosocial disabilities in general. And I would just put a small example. In Peru, the Ombudsman Office put a lot of pressure in services to stop the privation of liberty and involuntary treatment. What happened next was that families were going and chasing drug user centers, home detention, and in other countries, shackling, people chained. And I think this discussion goes beyond the medical sector. It's actually a discussion that goes, because I think at the end, every system is looking for ways to take people out. And if we don't change that, I think problems will keep arising. And they keep arising in many countries, especially in developing countries where we don't have services and we don't have institutions. But some form of deprivation of liberty is in place because we don't know how to react to those situations.
Yeah, deprivation of liberty is not always state sanctioned. If we could have a microphone down here in the front row, then up the back for Diana, and then across to my left-hand side.
Well, state institutionalization does not only apply to mental health, as far as I can see, because the state tries and dictates as to how person with disability, with even other forms of disability, should behave. For example, in India, we have Section 32, which the state tries and identifies special jobs for persons with disabilities, where persons with disabilities can perform only certain specific jobs, and it is based on a medical model. For example, if one leg is affected, this person can do this job. And if a person suffers from a hearing impairment, then this person can do this job. We will have reservations for this persons accordingly. So, is that not a cheap way to shy away from the state's liability to provide an equitable accessibility to employment, jobs, education, etc.? So if some light can be shed in this direction.
I understand your question, and yes, it does restrict people of choices. We are focusing on deprivation of the right to liberty at the moment. Would anyone from the panel like to pick up on that? Or can I suggest that our colleague save it for a side discussion at lunch? Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
I'd actually like to respond to that, because I was thinking right now of the various ways in which in developing countries, rights that you would not immediately think of as interrelated actually become quite interrelated. And this is how, for example, on this issue of deprivation of liberty. So when I worked at the Human Rights Commission, the first case I ever came across of a child who was locked up in the house pretty much the whole day, for years, is a child who had a visual disability, and because there was no accessible school, there was no school that he could go to, and because the caregiver had to go out and earn a living, that child was left locked up for hours, day after day after day. And ordinarily, you of course there are technical issues about how you define deprivation of liberty, but ordinarily you wouldn't think about inclusive education and questions of how someone is locked up.
Yes, you would.
Yes,
you would.
It's yeah. So
no, it's a very clear link. Sadly,
isn't it clearly linked in that kind of context? And the other issue on employment, for example, what I've found is So to Gabor's point about changing the law, I agree that it's important to change the law, but I'm also conscious of how often we tend to ignore laws anyway. for example, in Kenya, we have a mental health act that set up a mental health board. Trust me, that board was never given any funding. Like, it's just there on paper. So you have a mental health board, good for you. I'm concerned about what interventions we need at family level. And I'm concerned about the power dynamics between a person with a psychosocial disability and their family, as long as they're in a context of dependency. And this is where employment comes in. In the peer support groups that I've worked with, the people who are able to exercise the greatest amount of agency are the people who are also able to earn a living for themselves in one way or another. And I think it's important to highlight that.
I just want to sort of add one kind of caveat to what you're saying, especially that point you made that we have lots of so-called empowering laws and not too much happens around them. I do think that at a very core level, we would need to make this distinction between laws which deprive and laws which empower. Because laws which empower will always be, to that extent, weak in terms of implementation. But laws which deprive is a kind of carte blanche you give to the state. And it is to say that these should go is a very different proposition from the fact of that the others are not doing as much as they should be doing. So conflating these two is not wise. And the difficulty that we are running into in the context of disability is that you have a large number of deprivatory laws which are on the statute book. Until they are on the statute book, whoever is taking away that right from you is doing it in accordance with the law. And I do think, we would have a range of legal interventions happening. The kind of point you are making is in relation to a law which is empowering or disempowering, whichever way one wants to look at it, because identification of posts and the fact that, all right, some kinds of jobs only are available to persons with disabilities and others are not, and hence the sort of building of capabilities which happens, we are not sort of giving it enough purchase, let's say. The only, I think the point I would agree with Rosemary that if you were to, without denying the connections of that, there is an indivisibility in terms of rights. So there is education, employment, liberty, all of these in some way connect up with each other. There's no doubt about that. But if we try to discuss them all together, then some of the very pressing questions in relation to liberty may fall by the wayside. That would be my only caution. I mean, I don't disagree with you, and nor do I disagree with Elizabeth. But I think the logic of any kind of a thematic session is that there are some core questions of that session. They must get addressed, and we must focus and concentrate on them. That would be my, I think, in the point which Rosemary was trying to make there.
Could we have a microphone to the middle of the back row with Diana, and then we'll come down to the side. I mean, one of the strongest mental health services, well, not really services, programs that we have in Australia is around supported housing, having people having access to stable housing has the best outcomes for people who have experienced a mental illness. So yes, that interrelationship is incredibly important, but as Amita pointed out, there are core concepts that need to be explored before we get to that interrelationship point. Diana?
I wanted to caution us against thinking about detention and forced treatment as the cheap solution, because it is connected to big business. It's connected to big business, as Gabor pointed out, pharmaceuticals. It's also, in the US, connected to the prison industrial complex. I mean, these are huge stakeholders in detaining people, and people with psychosocial disabilities in particular. But I also want us to not be naive that the pharmaceutical industry is very happy that the Sustainable Development Goals might provide an opportunity now to get more medication to more people in more countries of the world. I really feel like we do need to focus on the demedicalization, because otherwise what is going to happen is that the pharmaceutical industry will be very much behind deinstitutionalization and community-based treatment, because it will provide an avenue for more business.
Who would?
And I'm not just being paranoid.
No.
I just wanted to.
No. Sadly, I think everyone sitting here is like, yeah, we all know how do we deal with it. Yes, it's a very real option. Yeah. Did you want to address Diana's point, Amita? Yeah, sure. No, we can take that question as well.
Okay, I think that I agree, and I'd just like to raise the point of older people in nursing homes, which in Ireland are privately owned and are a very big business, and older people with dementia who are inappropriately medicated and who say, I want to go home. So my question really is going back to Facundo on procedural accommodation in the civil context, Amita on positive obligation, and Article 12(3) on support for the exercise of legal agency. And I want to go back to law. I don't really understand the difference between deprivation of liberty and false imprisonment. I'm interested in how we provide support for exercising rights. So if there has been a deprivation of liberty, then how we challenge that within the legal system and challenge that abuse of power. So how do we turn this from a normative right into the exercise of legal agency and exercise those rights? How do we support that? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'd sort of very quickly, as a clarificatory too, because it was my saying it was a cheap solution. No, I mean, in the sense, sometimes it happens that you say something in shorthand, so it is important to at least elaborate by what you mean by when you're saying it's a cheap solution. It's a cheap solution to the extent of that the moment you start thinking in terms of a range of alternatives, the kind of investments that you need to make and the sort of, it's like when you have entrenched systems of power, and those entrenched systems of power let you do your thing, and there is a system of sharing of spoils. It is easy and cheap to the extent of to say, okay, we are providing this as a way of solving your really major problem. It's important that that problem should remain at that sort of height for a lot of social endorsement to go with that. You know, if families are not given any other kind of alternatives and you have a person who's disturbed, the person who's disturbed is saying, I do not want this choice, but that other choice is not available. Then consequently, a certain sort of, it may seem like a conspiracy theory sort of thing, but it is, a lot of people start getting complicit on this. The moment you need to create a repertoire of choices, a menu card of support, a whole range of interventions, that requires investments of a very different order. And I don't mean investments only in terms of money. And whereas the other one is like, it's a working system, it is happening, so it is easy and cheap to that extent. I mean, I meant cheap not just in terms of money, I meant in terms of effort, I meant in terms of, you would have to play one of the most complex kind of power games to sort of create that wedge between and say, all right, this is where the space is. To your question, I don't know whether it is addressed to me, but I suppose I can, as part of the panel, say, see, if you look at 12.1, 2, and 3, for me, like 12.3 is more a duty. It's a duty upon the state to create that range of support And evidently, if they fulfill their duty of 12.3, then some of the difficulties that we have in both 14 and 19 get addressed in a certain sort of way. If on the other hand, the moment we make 12.3 a right or an entitlement, which very often is how people speak about it, then an automatic consequence of when you make an entitlement, then you will say, okay, who is entitled to get support and who is not entitled to get support? And you start addressing the entire question in a very different manner whatsoever. And in my opinion, you provide that support, you must build in that entire range, and it is something which is not actually uniquely required only for people with disabilities. If we are speaking about universal capacity, I think the follow-up or concomitant thing to universal capacity is universal support. You have to recognize the fact that there is a certain level of human interdependence. The fact that people with disabilities have been more forthrightly seeking the support and others have been more covertly obtaining that support does not mean that support doesn't need to be sort of spoken of in more universal terms. The moment we speak about support in more universal terms and not confined only to people with disabilities, but something which is required for society at large, then I think the kind of discourse of equality, non-discrimination, which is there in Article 14, joins up with 12.3 to create a sort of a system. I thought the point that you were making about universalizing even the whole business of the intention component in criminal law, and to widen that range of how we are going to think in terms of, the kind of act I did absent-mindedly, the kind of act I did maliciously, the kind of act I did in a delusional or in a half-sleep state. If the moment we start thinking about the whole business of mental state of minds, I would say, I wouldn't say mental capacity, but states of minds, and to think of, like you'd have a quarrel with your partner and they'll say, I said that to you in my sleep. I have just woken up and now understand what I'm supposed to be, what I was saying then or not. Now, in terms of culpability, it evidently, you think about it and you say, okay, fine, and when in the dream and wakefulness state, there is a difference in how and what you're intending to what you are doing. So if we start using the CRPD discourse as generating an empathetic universal discourse, I think the kinds of alliances that we can be making with people would be way more powerful, and the sort of sustainability that you might have in what you are propounding, you may have many more takers. Vulnerability is not unique to people with disabilities. Just as strength is not unique to others. It's like both possess their own strength and vulnerability. And I think it's important for us to discuss these questions on that ground. Which is why I genuinely do think that the Equality Non-Discrimination Foundation and the universalized discourse with which Article 14 was fought through. I'm glad you reminded me of 10C and the entire, because there was in the working draft version of the CRPD, you actually did have provisions which allowed for deprivation of liberty on ground of, but it was speaking in terms of the fair process safeguards, the least restrictive alternative, all the jurisprudence which existed before the CRPD. And then in the process of discussing, and that's where you speak about the paradigm shift, you dropped each one of them one by one, saying that if you're going to have any provision, I mentioned this, that they were very, very zealous about saying you will not allow, irrespective of how many safeguards you put into it, you will not allow a provision by which you can, in fact, deprive people of liberty on grounds of disability or close on disability plus grounds. What you also kind of then worked on, but what you did not succeed to get was, you could not get a kind of straightforward prohibition of forced intervention or compulsory commitment. So you have in the CRPD a very, very interesting silence. You do not have a permission for force, you don't have a prohibition for force. You have a right to integrity and a well-compacted silence between civil society and state. I think it's up to us how we interpret that silence, how creatively we interpret that silence.
Thank you. I want to touch base on Diana's point very briefly. I think that progressive implementation of system-wide support system will be expensive. Expensive in terms of money. Also in a number of other resources. But we shouldn't be trapped on that one because we have reasonable accommodation, which is a very specific manner of addressing the requirements of different kinds of support that may be needed at some point. And that will not happen from, I mean, the system-wide process may not happen from one day to the other. A specific reasonable accommodation for specific people, that can happen from one day to another. And Yolin gave an excellent example of how this can be implemented with a very low-cost approach on that. So I think that the chip, when I heard the chip, I understood it from a procedural perspective. The chip in terms of easy, right? It's if you can lock up somebody, then that's the cheapest option that you have, or the easiest way. You don't have to deal with everything else. You don't have to consider that person in the moral dimension of the person itself, right? So it's the easiest way. Regarding challenging detention, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention recently developed guidelines to do that. And actually there are principles and guidelines that were developed by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and it's the only other UN body that is actually replicating the perspective of the CRPD committee in this sense. And that it's available for everyone to look at it. And basically what happened through that discussion and the International Disability Alliance and WNUSP and us, we really got involved in that process to try to go for this very clear methodological approach to it. And then, so the first thing is to recognize that if a person is deprived of his or her liberty on the basis of disability, that is arbitrary detention. And that's a very important first step. And it's established like that in the principles in the Working Group of Arbitrary Detention. So that's the first step. The second step is, even if that situation happens, then you are in a condition of illegality. So a person is detained illegally, then that person should have every other resource to challenge the detention as it is. And the working group goes on step by step, ensuring access to justice, providing procedural and reasonable accommodation, and all of these other elements that are necessary for a person to challenge the detention in itself. And including something that the CRPD committee has said, which is that there must be a way of reparation, because the person was detained against the law. So if the state is intervening in that sense, there must be a reparation for that person.
Okay. We've got, sorry? Oh, Yolanda, sorry. Yeah, sure.
About the not being cheap of the institutionalization, it's very expensive, and especially in the long term, because it's only making things worse. And I studied sustainability in engineering. So in the technical environment, you also see that they make a lot of cheap products that are very pollutive for the environment. And the issue of sustainability means to take a long-term view and to see in the long term what is happening. And this is very important also for mental health care, to take this long-term view and to see like what is the real outcome. And in sustainability, this worked very well. In about 20 years, the vision has completely changed. So I think there's hope.
True. We some of our biggest gains have been around the argument that We can't afford to do it, but we can't afford not to do it. That the damage that is being done to human beings is just creating more cost and more damage and more broken lives. And so it's not that you can't afford to do it, you can't afford not to do it. Alison down here on the side in the middle, if she can remember what her question is by now. And then to the gentleman in the maroon jumper that I'm looking at. And then there's a question up the back.
Yeah, it was more of a comment than a question, and I guess it was just my reflections in the different areas that I'm working on in terms of CRPD implementation, that we really do, in addition to, to changing laws, but we really need a profound cultural shift. And whether it's inclusive education or deprivation of liberty or legal capacity, I think one of the things that we need to be working on very deliberately are communications campaigns and campaigns to change public attitudes. And Jolene, I was thinking what you were presenting, just how powerful it could be to have just a short documentary on, the experience in the Netherlands and how there could be public outcry, if there was something that was really successfully done through Facebook. We've got so many social media platforms these days that, it seems like there are ways that perhaps we're not utilizing to mobilize public outrage and public opinion. And the other thing that I keep thinking about is revolutionizing training, right? Revolutionizing for inclusive education, it's teacher training. You want to do inclusive education, you need people and schools and to understand what inclusive education is and to just completely change their attitudes. And I think we need to revolutionize medical training. The doctors are the ones that are writing the prescriptions, that are locking people up, that are making these decisions. Doesn't matter what the law says, really. So bringing in concepts of intentional peer support, of open dialogue, of family group counseling, and having these be things that psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers study. I feel like that's also where we need to be working.
Which also brings us back to Big Pharma funding medical training. Funding medical training.
Fund alternatives.
Yeah.
Doing in legal education.
Yolan, would you like to pick up at all on the cultural change? You don't have to. I just thought you might.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. Did anybody else want to pick up on Alison's point? No. Okay. Well, we'll go.
My question is coming from actually sort of a kind of a Vulcan mind meld, because it was really similar to your question, but maybe in a somewhat bit of a different direction. And actually was struck by Joan Lynch, two comments that you said. One was, I was struck by one of your advocates was a nurse, or there were nurses that were sensitive to your issue. So providers have a place here, but they have to have awareness and they have to have training. And the other thing that you said that struck me was taking the long-term view. So here's my question. I'm curious, is what has been the response of universities in your respective countries that have, are they sort of part of the problem? Are they part of the solution? And what I'm really interested in, are there examples in your countries where universities have, in terms of training, medical doctors, psychologists, social workers, in America here it'd be rehab counselors. So I'm interested if there's any kind of connections that you've developed in your respective countries that you see like, okay, let's take a long-term view, and so if you have examples, I'd be really interested in hearing that.
Jan?
Yeah, about universities, well, there's a lot of variety in that as well. I know some some students that do ethics or philosophy, they are generally very understanding. Then the project that was done with the university on family group conferencing, then we faced the limit of the funding application that was filled in by this professors from this university, and it's a medical university. And the biggest problem actually is that the guy who was chairing this group, he hadn't been active in the practice for at least 20 years, so he couldn't even stop using the word patient, and that was quite terrible. So I think that's one of the things that sometimes they're very medical model oriented. They have to work within a medical model frame, and some are really distant from reality. But then in the non-medical universities, I find more support.
I teach at a University of Law, and amongst the things we've been able to do with some level of success has been that because we're obligated to teach the law as is, the manner in which we've started to construct our curriculum is to then teach what it is and then to say exactly why what is problematic. And, you have your dedicated, see, the way it works out is you have your specialized disability studies courses or disability rights courses, but they're always elective courses. So students who are interested in will take them. So the strategy that we've employed is you have the legal capacity component comes in several mandatory courses. You can't teach a course in contract law, you can't teach a course in criminal law, in property. It comes at, so you started to kind of weave in the whole interrogation of legal capacity questions in the mainstream course and challenge enough number of students to think differently about it. The other thing somewhere was that as a university, we got involved in the whole law reform process, were asked to kind of assist a committee which had been nominated by the government. So you got in a large number of students involved in that cutting edge research. And it was like literally drawing from, the point that Kuhn makes when he talks about paradigm shifts. One of the very major points he makes, in some ways I think it was being spoken of yesterday too, when we're saying to catch young people kind of thing. But the point I'm trying to make is that if there is a paradigm shift, the new paradigm has to create their own personnel and their own textbooks and their own way of looking at things. You cannot expect that people who have been schooled in the old paradigm are the ones who are going to be really the soldiers of the new paradigm. And I think that's wherein universities have a role to play. And it's a kind of initiative we are doing at my university, and also trying consequently to share it with other colleagues elsewhere and saying, it's not necessary that this has to be done in a frontal kind of manner where you say, you take your flag and you say, oh, we're going to get everybody. But you can do it in a very subversive sort of manner, in an insidious manner almost, where you just get in and you do your thing. And you start getting people to think differently. And once they start thinking differently, I think doing differently becomes an easier proposition.
Elizabeth?
I just wanted to make a quick comment on your question on universities from an African context as well. There's a project that's funded by Open Society Foundations that's introducing disability rights law in universities as a course of study in universities in Southern Africa and East Africa. And part of that project is about connecting universities to DPOs and to begin to work together on important issues like awareness raising, law reform, and things like that. So So mental health law might be one of the things some of the universities take up, but also crucially important is the question of inclusion of students with disabilities within the specific universities as well, which is a discussion that doesn't always arise, but which is a discussion that the schools that are part of the project are beginning to really take forward in their own universities. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question up the back, and then one to the far side, and then down the front. And I think that may have to be it. We'll see how we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Zahid Abdullah, and I'm from Pakistan. Non-disabled community has been making very informed, rational choices which have been detrimental to the cause of the disabled people. When we look at the way humanity has progressed since times immemorial, right from infanticide of children, when we used to live in caves, and even when we go to the era when Plato in his Politics wrote that, children when they are born, they should be examined, and there should be a committee to examine them, and if one found with some physical deformity, that child should be thrown from the mountain and killed. And then when we come to the latter half or the last quarter of, say, 19th century, the theory of eugenics was introduced, and most of us know what happened. It was, if the caveman exercised that rational choice, killing of the disabled, we can see from his point of view, in a daily struggle with average age only in the 20s, it was a rational choice. For militant and warlike society of Greece, it was a rational choice for them. In the, when the eugenics was introduced, it was also, for them at least, rational choice. And when it was put into implementation in the Second World War, and in most of the countries in Europe, it was, the euthanasia and the killing of the disabled people, it was a rational choice. So my question is, when we are talking about the institutionalization and the rights, we have progressed in many ways. We have made a lot of progress with regard to the rights of persons with disabilities, and we all know that in some ways more things change, more they remain the same as well. So, we are at the cusp of what we call, what is going to be an era of designer babies. So I wanted to ask this distinguished panel, and anybody who would like to dwell upon it, in this era, when they are going to hobnob at prenatal stage, the kind of children that they are going to have, and it is almost there, or we will be there when parents will be making those choices. So again, rational choices, what would they mean? What would be the moral implication? And at academic level, this university, and other universities, where is the debate? And what is our position? Because we need to be ahead of it. Thank you.
Genetic selection, anyone?
See, this whole business of value of a disabled life comes in several ways. And it also always kinds of intersects with what the non-disabled world believes is their choice. I don't think it lends to any easy answers. to, like we have the whole realm of disability selective abortions, to speak about, okay, do we prohibit them? Is it more in the realm of discourse and sensitization that we have to address this question? Or is it in the realm of legal regulation that we have to address this question? And I genuinely think that possibly, I'm not saying that it's irrelevant, that wouldn't be fair, but I would, in the sense of, and this is only my personal opinion that I'm putting forth to you. I had a student who did a PhD in disability selective abortions and ultimately came to this entire, the conclusion that she came to was that you needed to inform parents about exactly what it is to have a child with disability and not let them make their decisions on the strength of medical prejudice or stereotypes. You must have, like if you're being told, say that you're going to have a Down syndrome baby, then you must know exactly what it is to be bringing up a Down syndrome baby. What is it that a person who's supposed to have Down syndrome brings into the world or not? To be enabling people to make informed choices. That's where she came to. She said that if you prohibit it also, you may just drive it underground. You may have a large number of people getting exposed to a whole range of other quackery, rather than to take just the regulatory mode. I empathize from where you are coming. I'm only sort of saying to you that I do not think there are very easy answers. Similarly, when it comes to, like on the other hand, when you talk about euthanasia and you talk in terms of continued treatment and the effect of that persons with disabilities to be accessing the kind of medical treatment which is routinely extended to non-disabled people, I would somewhere want to put more of my money there first and talk of this more in terms of discourse and sensitization and getting, I think as more and more people with disabilities and the value of a disabled life comes through, there will be many more people who would be takers to listening. That's the way I'm seeing it. I'm not trigger happy in terms of using the law too soon. I feel when you do it, it has its own, it has its counterproductive effects, which very often we don't realize. In our sense of outrage, we believe that bringing in a law would solve it all. But the law then generates its own range of problems, which, because it's a rigid norm, it is difficult to negotiate with. I think you want to say something?
Okay, up the back, yep.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions. One is about the possibilities for cross-movement alliances with other groups that are forcibly psychiatrized, or I don't know how you say that, like trans people who face forced psychiatry to affirm their gender identity in official documents, political dissidents, and also the anti-rape movement in terms of examples in Colombia we've had of extreme violence where immediately the rape or acid attacks are attributed to mental insanity as an argument to respond to that. So not what opportunities, but I guess if you've seen it or have examples of experiences. And the other question that, I don't know, maybe is for Facundo, is the issue of Article 14 in cases of people that are already in prison. So in the projects that we worked on with people with disabilities in prison, then it's not people that were deemed incapable to stand trial, but people that are within the prison that then start facing for psychiatry. And I think that there's a different, because there are all the arguments about social control, suicide watch, all these practices within prisons that end up in forced psychiatry, like if you can comment on that.
Okay, well, because that's two sets of questions, we'll take those as the last two questions. Facundo, did you want to address the second one first?
Regarding the cross movement, very briefly, yes, there is a lot of opportunity there. I think there are a lot of synergies that could be found. There are some efforts around that happen in different places in the world. So I think it's a good strategy to try to explore more. The second one that has to do with what's happening in prison. If a person, let's say the person is found guilty and it's imprisoned, and then there is a condition that it's identified in many systems, it's like the worst case scenario that could happen. Many countries, for instance, they suspend the sentence in prison, so you are still in prison, so you're still deprived of liberty, but that time that you are deprived of liberty, it's actually not considered for the sentence that you are, so the time that you are doing. So that's one thing that is happening. The second one is that people already in prison are forced to treatment, and actually there is no escape from that one, because and it happens in a very, very often and horrible conditions. So that it's also another condition that is happening there. I think that the solution for that is, of course, legal reform around criminal systems that do comply with that kind of approach. First, the one that is extremely abusive, which is because you don't have a capacity, that's the understanding that it's taken, that you can be suspended on the sentence and still be deprived of liberty. It's really appalling. I don't think there is any argument to support for that, but unfortunately it continues to happen. The second one, it's really about forced treatment. So legal capacity and exercise of Article 12 rights should be a solution for that one.
Would anyone like to pick up on the forming alliances? Yeah. Forming alliances with other groups such as...
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities in terms of forming alliance, and especially, and I think it goes beyond also just deprivation of liberty, but challenging the power of the medical sector, and of course, in the trans and intersex community, they face a lot of issues related to the pathologization of the body. But then we can explore other spaces in terms of drug users, and they face a lot of involuntary commitment and treatment, and in many cases in the same facilities of persons with psychosocial disabilities. We had an experience in Peru when we were advocating against the law on deprivation of liberty on the basis of mental conditions. At some point, we got into contact with a group of drug users, and that was the name of they call it themselves drug users to avoid the stigma of drug addicts. And it was very interesting. We never concreted more actions, but in that particular case, we joined voices in terms of we cannot allow legislation that actually leads to deprivation of liberty on those bases. But it's important also to not conflate different groups, and I think we tend to understand, and it was a very interesting discussion actually in this center a couple of years ago, I remember, that the CRPD protects drug users. And I remember one of the activists that came to this meeting and saying, probably we have a very medical approach to the issue. We will conclude that drug consumption is addiction, and addiction is a mental health condition, and because it's a mental health condition, could lead to disability. And I think the best way to see this is actually, it could be a presumption of disability from society, but I think we have to also avoid to conflate different groups in terms of just thinking in terms of impairment. Every time we deal with a behavior that doesn't fit with what society expects from us, no?
So are you saying they're in or out?
Yeah. Because we definitely see them as in, but anyway. Yeah.
Well, about building alliances, one thing that particularly was helpful is that we don't use the medical language. So, for example, our protest was called Protest Against Isolation Cells. And of course, in mental health care, they call it seclusion. So then in the beginning, the nurses were like more like, but why do you use this word? You know, it's called seclusion. But why we chose exactly the word isolation cell because it's clear, and we like to use the human language. And in that way, we could connect to a lot of students and young persons who still think for themselves and who still have their ideals. And that was very helpful. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay. Thank you very much to the panellists. They've been here for the long haul this morning. Three of them in particular, Amita, Facundo and Yolin. I'd like to thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Elizabeth and Alberto for rounding out the second panel. So if we could thank our panellists this morning. I will now release them for a well-earned lunch. And once they've got out there and got on the front of the queue, you lot can leave.